A huge welcome to today's BLOXHUB Debates. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you are. It is, as always, such a pleasure to welcome you to BLOXHUB. Today's debates, leading the way to maximum standards for healthy buildings, is what we will be talking about. My name is Pernille Berg. I'm Science Manager here at BLOXHUB. I'm your moderator today, and it is absolutely wonderful to welcome you. A huge privilege, I might add, the reason that you will find out just in a few seconds. To those of you who are with us for the very first time, BLOXHUB is placed city centre in Copenhagen. We're a co-working community, but we're much more than that. We aim to be an active network organisation that contributes to bridging science with practice and to also contributing to the innovative solutions that improve the built environment for the planet and people. This is the grand finale of our series, Healthy Buildings, High Performance, Happy Hearts and Minds. And we couldn't be here without a huge thanks to our partners in crime. Build, Aalborg University, Climate, Lys Technologies, PropTech Denmark, Realdania, Velux, and Danish Sound Cluster. A thank you to you. We've had 10 events, 5 science talks, 5 BLOXHUB debates with the one today included, and it has been an absolutely formidable journey to address the topic of healthy buildings. But the grand finale would definitely not be the blast that it's going to be without this wonderful panelists that are joining us today, both virtually and physically. I'd like you to introduce and welcome you to Sven Buch, Development Manager, Himmerland Boligforening, Social Housing. Thank you, Sven, so much for being with us. We're really, really happy to have you here, albeit virtually, but that is just as good. Then we have Markussen, Raffnsøe, Technical Director, Green Building Council. Thank you, Lau, for being with us here today. Johanne Mose Entwistle, Head of Value Documentation from AART. Thank you very, very much. Jørn, Toftum, Professor, Technical University of Denmark. Thank you for joining us. Last but absolutely not least, Tine Steen Larsen, Head of Division, Build in Aalborg University, Division of Sustainability, Energy and Indoor Environment. Thank you, Tine. I have looked so much forward to today, and I can already assure you guys watching us that you're in for some debate, because just as I always do before we go live, we have a small so this is the rundown, this is the setup. I think that I know what I'm doing. My panelists said today, this is a great plan you have, Pernille. We of course don't agree with you. So we're in for an excellent debate. What we're looking at today as the grand finale is the holistic perspective and the how-to. Because as much as we like to debate healthy buildings, we also need to have some sort of assurance on where we go next and how do we actually assure that we have healthy buildings in the future. We have a lot of knowledge about healthy buildings. What is a healthy building? Why should we all live, work and spend time in healthy buildings? From light, indoor air quality, temperature, acoustics to space, we know a lot. We may not necessarily agree on what the various things are, and we'll get back to that. But one question is, why do we not build healthy buildings as the most natural thing? Why do we build from what some people would say minimum standards rather from maximum standards? And what is a standard? Those are some of the questions that we're addressing in today's debate. We will, in other words, share the latest methods and tools in designing and creating healthy buildings and hopefully lead the way to better buildings. To assist us during the debate and to make sure that you can also ask your questions and pose your comments, I have my wonderful colleague on the chat. So you are more than welcome to ask all the things that you would like to ask. Helle is ready to guide you through the debate, and I will receive your questions and comments on my phone, and then the panelists will answer them as acutely as they've already answered some of my questions. But enough from me. Now to our panelists. Thank you so very much for joining us and me today. I think you know, I have been looking forward to it, and I'm already very excited. And my very first question, as promised, we have learned from the previous debates, we know that we spend 90% of our lifetime indoors. every time that I actually calculate how many years I've already spent indoors, I get slightly depressed, but that is another matter, because I've also had very good times inside beautiful buildings. But when Joseph Allen and John McComber from Harvard advocate so strongly that we should actually change our standards, as this would contribute to much better buildings, why is it that we don't build from maximum standards, and what is a maximum standard? I will let you answer that question, and we'll start with Tine, and then we'll go along each and every one of you, and that will kickstart our debate. Thank you. And
thank you, Pernille. And then I'm sure we will not agree on this, but I'll start. I think the idea of having maximum standards, for me, working with indoor environment, that could be fantastic, amazing. Let's do that. But I think also reality comes very close here, and we have to realize that money is a very important parameter here. So of course we could have the maximum standards, but who will pay? It always goes down to who will pay. So that's one aspect of it. So maybe why we don't do it. The other one is regulation. We have seen that on the energy area, we have had the requirements going up through the last 20 years at least, where they have been tightened every fifth year. We haven't seen the same on indoor environment. We could hope for it or wish for it, but it always comes down to who will pay. So as long as we also don't have the requirements, then it's kind of a voluntary basis to do it, and that's really hard to make people do that. So it would be the ideal world, but also not a realistic world, in my perspective.
Interesting. Do you agree, Jørn?
No, I would like to challenge that thinking, also the question, because not all buildings are the same. So if we look at the building that we are occupying right now, BLOXHUB, wonderful architecture, can be discussed, of course, but many things have been done to also promote the indoor environment in this building. So, as I said, buildings are different. Maybe American buildings are different from European buildings. So the standards that are used to measure the conditions in these buildings differ between the buildings. So we have good buildings and we have less good buildings, even poor buildings. And if we look at the standards, then it's if we use the word standard as a metaphor for common practice, or if we use standards as the standards that provide the criteria that Tine mentioned, that's very often used by those who design the buildings to set these requirements, to set the standards for the indoor environment, both in terms of lighting, temperatures, air quality, ventilation, and so forth. And that's not only minimum requirements in these standards. They have different quality classes. So these the quality of the indoor environment is actually the result of a negotiation between the builder or developer and the designer often. Of course, there's still some legislation that has to be abided by, but that's more both in terms of the energy use, as you mentioned, Tine, and also in terms of the indoor environment. So my point is that we have standards, but they're not always minimum only. And maximum, as you mentioned, Joe Allen's book, is probably at a level where we are not entirely clear yet. We don't have exact knowledge what is maximum standard for promoting good performance for the occupants of the buildings and so forth. So that's still some areas where we can learn more to be better to design buildings.
Interesting. We'll get back to that. I'm quite curious in terms of the negotiation. We can get back to that, but also in terms of the occupants. It's also a thing that a topic that you have researched into, so it'll be interesting to dive into that as well. Johanne, what do you think?
Well, I think building on both basically is also a reason that comes back to the great professional complexity that is actually in the building industry. So in these building processes, there's a lot of often conflicting considerations that we need to take into account. So in other words, buildings based on a maximum standard which relates to indoor climate may compromise a lot of other standards or a lot of other wishes or requirements for that particular building. So I think when it comes to, the challenge, how do we build the best building for the end user, I'm not sure that standards are actually the answer. And if the other challenge is how do we make the building industry deal with indoor climate in a more holistic way, I'm pretty sure that standards is not the answer either. Because having standards and dealing and operating based on standards could have the risk of actually making us forget to deal with the building as a whole. So this holistic view on indoor climate then compromises the holistic view on the building as a whole. And indoor climate is just one parameter that affects the way that people experience and use the building, but there are so many other parameters that we need to take into account as well. So I think that's my take on that for now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lau, you just had me when you basically said, but Pernille, we are not necessarily in agreement what is good indoor climate. So I've been looking forward to your answer to the question in terms of the standards.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to maybe start at a slightly different place.
Wonderful.
Just with pointing out the fact that architecture is a very visual practice, a very visual aesthetic. And from an engineering perspective, I'm an engineer at trade. Indoor climate is almost always to compensate for bad choices in the design. So you have to compensate for too much sun, for too much heat, for not enough ventilation, for very deep buildings, and so it's very difficult to go into a design process that have the basic in visual practice, and then try to assess very invisible parameters like acoustics and ventilation and temperature, and all these parameters are invisible. You cannot see them from the beautiful pictures. And not only as an architect, but also when you go look for a new build as a new home you want to buy, you assess it by the visual representation of it, because it takes time to assess the acoustics, the soundproofing, the ventilation, the heating. You are not there the whole time. You're only at one specific time. Maybe the indoor climate is good at that day. If it's a summer day with lots of sun, but you have no idea what it is on the other times of the year in the winter time. So you have a qualified guess, but that is
I think it's a wonderful point. Lone Pfeiffer from Velux in one of the debates said we need to give air a shape. Exactly as you're saying, it's invisible. We can't touch it. So we need to give it a shape, and I'll get back to that because I know Jørn has also looked in terms of sensors and actually has sometimes an optimistic perspective on what the technology can help us with in actually shaping and concretizing these intangibles. So I think it's a really wonderful point.
And then we have the design, where we have some minimum requirements in the building codes, and we fulfill the minimum requirements based on some kind of typical user situation. But it is always up to the users to the way they use the buildings and the systems in the building, and are they able to make the indoor climate that they prefer. Some of us want it warmer, some of us want it colder, some of us have poor eyesight, needs much more light than other people. So there's not like one standard that you can design a building for. You have to design it for a whole range of users. Yeah. And if you want like a room with many people in it, some of them are always going to be unsatisfied. Yeah. It's because we have different requirements.
And we learned from Lys Technologies, as one of the partners also, that our needs change, not just based on, one thing is our circadian rhythm, but also our age, which is something also to bear in mind. So just as you say, one size doesn't fit all. So Sven, coming from your perspective, these are the experts talking, and basically they're saying there isn't one size fits all. So then how do we ensure a healthy, good people for the inhabitants, the occupants? What would you say?
You are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, hi.
That's
Here I
okay.
am. No, thank you for the inputs here. I think, like your other panelists, it's a very complex issue. I will start to say about standards, also connecting what Tine said. We are very dependent on standards because like us in the social housing sector, we are so to call the low end of the building industry. So we are very dependent on that. We have a market who function and a market who can produce good standard solutions, because we are not able to be front runners very much. Maybe front runners in some parts of the spectrum, but not all of it. And also the conditions we work under as a social housing is also, that is very essential for us. That is the user democracy we have and the dialogue we have with our tenants. So it's and we need all the tenants all the time for investments to have the tenants back up for what we do. And that means when we go over minimum standards, we need to argue, and we need to have discussion with our tenants. And so therefore we are very happy about that. The level of the knowledge and research has focused on this very important field.
I think it's a very good point. So before we say goodbye to a set of requirements, to basically hear your perspective in terms of the negotiation that Jørn also addressed. Are you the client in constructing a new building, for example, or who is negotiating on your users' behalf?
Oh, sorry, question for me?
Yeah, it was a question for a follow-up question, just to basically try and explicate a little bit as Jørn was saying, that it's the negotiation that takes place. Who is negotiating on behalf of your occupants, of your users?
Oh, we have boards. We have local boards with tenants. Of course, they are not. Some of them have the knowledge about. We have about the field, but of course, it's our responsibility as an organization, to provide knowledge for our tenants. That means, the architects, the engineers. We work with the projects. We, of course, have requirements for them to present different alternatives and possible choices in order to. And of course, every project starts with, even of course, if it's existing housing complex, starts with a research about and also interviews with the boards and the local people. What kind of challenges are we talking about with noise or with mold or whatever cold, whatever kind of climate is the state of art.
Excellent. Because going back to you, Tine, you basically said there is an ideal world where it would be really nice always to make sure that we have the best building possible. But who will pay? And when we had the debate on light, we actually had a representative from, and I'll now say it in Danish, Bygherreforening, the association of clients. And he very honestly said, well, so far, if the parameter of light, it doesn't make a difference. It's not where we make the money. So if we improve the light inside the building, it doesn't make a difference. So when we then know the impact on well-being and performance that light actually has, that aspect of, as you're saying, the schism or between the ideal world and what happens when we have to have someone who pays for it, there seem to the best comes up short, if I can put it like that. But you have developed a tool or a holistic frame where we can actually measure or get an indication of how to include some of the parameters that would provide a good indoor climate.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit how that would then...
Actually, I'd like also just to go into this, to make clear, it's not always expensive to have more light. It's very important to say that it's not always expensive. Maybe it's also the point in having it into the design at an early stage, so you can actually have it for free, at least some of it.
Okay.
So it's also a matter of good design. So it's just important to stress that it's not always expensive.
But that's a good
it's
point.
Actually design.
Yeah. So just because that is also getting back to what Lau is saying, that the designer is projecting something that is visual and tactical, and light or air. How can we include that and make those aspects integrated in the design process?
And what we did in the tool, we had this holistic approach, so still not holistic according to Johanne, but holistic according to thermal, visual, acoustic and atmospheric comfort. So the indoor environmental parameters in one tool. And our idea was here to have a tool where you can actually look at how these interact, because they are connected. So we have them all in one tool. So when I expand the windows, then I can actually see instantly how will it affect acoustics, how will it affect thermal, so I have this relation between them. Now you also mentioned earlier that Lone said this give air a shape.
Yeah.
What we actually wanted in the tool was also to give indoor environment a language. So you could make it much more tangible. So we are using the scale that everybody knows from energy performance certificates, so the A to G scale, but now we have developed it for indoor environment. So we have an overall rating for the dwelling, and then we have also one rating for each of the 4 parameters, so thermal, visual, acoustic and atmospheric. So all of these are rated. What's also important in the tool is that the assessment is for the building, so not the occupant behavior. So there are no measurements. We didn't want to assess the occupant behavior and give them a rating. It's actually the building alone. So it's the physical frames of the building that's included in the tool. And then by using that in the design or in an existing building, it's possible to do both. You can have this overview. So we did it actually in Sven's dwellings because the design team already knew these dwellings and they had already designed them, and then we tried to expand this and make a workshop actually with a full process for a building. So one day we were designing and building a building. But what we could see when they applied the tool on the building that they knew very well, they actually improved the indoor environment just by simple design. But having it in much more early in the process. So I think that's the purpose of the tool and how it works. In short, yes.
And as you're saying, by including this earlier in the design process, it doesn't have to be the typical add-on. It doesn't have to be more expensive.
No, and also what you can see is that especially acoustics is very highly related to the building and the design. So acoustic is very difficult to fix later on. It's something that you almost always have the best solutions when you have it early in the design. So it's not something that you can fix. So that's why it's so important to have it there and not trying to fix something later. That will not be the best solution, definitely.
And now you basically said that Johanne would probably have a different definition of what is holistic. Do you have an urge to comment on what Tine has just said?
What I would like to build on it, because I think what you're talking about, Tine, makes a lot of sense to me, and a lot of sense in the way that we work at AART, trying to think holistically from the beginning, and then also adding other holistic parameters than just indoor climate. And I know that because I'm outside the very technical, and I don't have a great knowledge about indoor climate as such. So for me, it's not that complicated. But that's just because I don't have the knowledge to know it's complicated. I realize that. But so my point being that what we try to look at is then, so how can this choice of architecture, how can this particular design, which both adds good daylight qualities, how can this particular design choice also add to other impact goals, like a sense of community? So one of our projects, Nye, they had a very high ambition on social sustainability, and they wanted to create community. And some of the choices that we've made in the houses, maybe when you look at the houses the first time, you would think, oh, that's big windows facing the common areas. And I actually expected that people, would draw the curtains all the time. When I went there, revisited once these buildings were taken into use, what the people told me was, well, the windows, they give us great daylight, which is actually a sales parameter, linking back to your economical talk. So that actually made them buy the building in the first place, or one of the reasons they bought the building. But also, this great window, this transparency between the private sphere and the common shared sphere actually added and actually helped build community, a positive sense of community. And also the good acoustics, the acoustic privacy that they mentioned in these interviews as well, also helped add to a positive sense of community, because then you could focus on the positive sides of community instead of having neighbor noise and kind of getting irritated. So just adding and just thinking, so integrate design from the beginning. Don't stop at the impact goals relating to indoor climate. Just add on and think, how can we add even further and even more impact goals that would create even more value for this building and these users? And I'm sure you already do that, so yeah.
So in that sense, you are in agreement with what Jørn said, that Joe Allen's latest book, that we don't know what these performance goals are. We are on our way to designing this.
Well, I'm thinking that a performance goal, you can't set a universal performance goal because it depends on each building project, which is...
But let's define performance. I mean performance, the occupant's performance in the building, how it's affected by the indoor environment. But performance there could be many dimensions.
Because you also mentioned early on that you'd like to include other parameters than the occupants. So I thought this was quite interesting in that we have from Lau saying that the occupants are very different, but we also have from Jørn saying that we need to identify what is it the occupants expect the building to perform. If I understood you correctly, Jørn.
No, not entirely. Not the building to perform, but how it affects their ability to work.
Yeah.
We know that it does that. I mean, if you're working in a very high temperature, then it's with decreased performance, very poor air quality. In schools, for instance, that reduces the learning outcome. So the indoor environment as such also affects how we perform as humans. And that's what we are focusing on from our side.
Because you had, I read an interview or a statement from you where you basically said if we allow the occupants to control some of the mechanism in regulating the indoor climate, that would actually help the performance of the building. Like, and without going into specifics, but you basically said that we as people, when we use a building, we cause part of the humidity within the building.
Right.
So I was then relating to one a research that is documenting that sometimes the occupants just don't know how to use these smart systems.
Indeed. Absolutely agree with that. I agree with you, not
but basically then we're back to what Lau said. But Pernille, we don't know what good indoor climate is, so there is a performance gap. There also seems to be a widespread acceptance that sometimes the buildings, there is a performance gap into how we expect the building to perform and how the occupants actually rate the buildings, how they feel their well-being is rated. Is that correct? Yes and no. I mean, as engineers, we can design a building so that it's completely automated. And that has been done over and over again. But they do not provide very satisfied users often because they are entirely overruled by all the automatic systems. So what we have found is that people like to have some influence on the indoor environment, which in itself may cause them to accept the indoor environment, may be more tolerant to the indoor environment than otherwise.
if it's
And
mandated.
one of the wonderful, and it may be a colloquial example, but I still love it, is that when you have an automated ventilation system and the occupant is told you can't open the windows.
Have you ever experienced that in real life?
Yes.
Okay, I have never met that in real life.
I have, and I won't mention any concrete buildings. Suffice it to say, it has happened, and it has been also in the annual satisfaction surveys. It has been one of the things. We run out of the building, we stampede to the terrace, we feel like breaking the window, and we're not allowed. So I have actually the anecdotal empirical evidence from unscientific research, but albeit truthful survey submissions. So you hear that a lot. And my question is, of course, is this an aspect where we have to educate someone like me, the occupant of the building, as to how I should use the sensors? I've had Lone Pfeiffer show me the monitor that she uses, where I said, that is really fascinating. Develop a language so I can interpret the numbers. So I don't know, Jørn, can you help me?
I think you're the best sensor.
Yeah.
So we would like to sample your input and use it for control of the building. We can hear, we can see, we can smell, we can feel the temperature and so forth.
Yeah.
So we can measure all the parameters of the indoor environment. So it's us who decide if it's acceptable or not, if it's comfortable.
It's a very good point. And Sven, you have a comment.
Yeah, of course I agree ideally about this point that the user themselves, but we can already experience a lot of times that, for instance, in our older stock, where mold it can be an issue. One can experience that people can live in quite a long time without realizing they are exposed by mold, and they're quite living in a very not a very healthy environment, and are not forgetting for somehow to open the windows and get fresh air into. So surprisingly, so we have as a standard now, we have these very simple sensors for humidity, who collects data, and when the humidity is extended over a longer period, has a high level, they will get a red light on the sensor. Very simple, and it works very much. But I think most of people need help to realize what healthy indoor climate is.
Yes. And I think it's a wonderful point that the occupant should not fallaciously be seen as the expert user of the building, although, as Jørn says, but we are a good testament as to how we experience the indoor climate. There is a balance.
There is a balance, and there's also a difference between dwellings that Sven represents, and a building like this one, where you have all the automatic systems. So in dwellings, it's very much the occupants who decide how it is. Do they open windows, like Sven says? Do they take care of airing after showering or when cooking and all this? So nudging or some means to show what is good behavior in your home is also a good means that can be used.
Yeah. Johanne?
Can I just add to that? Because it just made me think. I've also worked with the same sector as Sven's earlier, and from the interviews that we did there, it just made it became really clear that indoor climate, yes, it's a consideration, it's a concern for the people living there. And Sven, you're more than welcome to contradict me. But there are so many other concerns that are just more important in people's everyday life. So even when they've done retrofitting of some of these old buildings, and they've put in these really great new systems, they take up space. So suddenly you're missing a cupboard that you used to have, but you don't have anymore. So you don't have any storage. Or you have some kind of ventilation vent going on that you just, stuff a towel into because you can't be bothered to listen to the noise. So it's not that people are stupid or that they don't have the knowledge, I think. Sometimes it is also a knowledge issue, but it's just as much as there are just a lot of contradicting competing concerns for people in their everyday lives. And indoor climate, even for us, it's really interesting, but for a lot of normal people, not so interesting.
I think also that this is tapping into what Lau was saying, that there is a complexity here in terms of, just as you're saying, there are competing parameters in our everyday lives. So the ventilation may be very noisy. I've seen case studies where you have the examples of the cotton wool, the towel, and solid tape basically masking the ventilation, and it looks absolute. I get always impressed by the creative solutions in how to block the ventilation. But how do we then, or maybe rephrasing my question, why is it so difficult to ensure this holistic approach? Like, Tine, you have designed a holistic approach. Jørn, you're advocating also that we need to actually ensure the users tools and ways in which that they can navigate and control their own indoor climate. Johanne, you're pointing to that we need to go beyond the parameters of just the occupant. So as Lau wonderfully said, good indoor climate varies depending who you're asking. Then what is also the holistic perspective? Like, what is the holistic perspective when we're looking at healthy buildings? And why is it so difficult to design it?
I think it is important to notice that we do, by scientific knowledge, know what is like the minimum requirements for a healthy indoor environment. So we know it's bad when we have mold and too little in ventilation. And people might not be aware of it, based on all different kinds of factors, and we should, as a society, help them to achieve minimum requirements. Yeah. But there is a long way from talking minimum requirements and then talking what you had this maximum standard as a high performance indoor environment. And there's a big difference between talking old buildings, existing buildings with very inadequate systems. There's a noisy ventilation, not so good ventilated, insulated facades, where temperature might be the big issue. And then talking new build, top of the line design with all different kind of automation system. And if we try to put that down in the same basket, then we lose sight of what is the perspective.
Yes.
So if you talk new build and technological systems, I believe that the more technological the systems become, the more there's a difference between what you feel as a person and the technological and the indoor environment. So the more sensors and stuff you put in, the more difficult it becomes to accept and to change the environment for you as a person. But we can of course design.
Just so I understand, what you're saying is that once the more automatic and technologically driven the building becomes, the more I lose a feeling of ability to navigate my own indoor climate?
Yeah, very good put. Very good. This is exactly what my point is. And that is a very different discussion than talking about Sven's building stock. That is the dwellings, and some of them are quite probably like 50, 100 years old, and of course we'll have some problems because the building technology was very different at the time, and we didn't have the same standards for ventilation and heating and lighting as we do today. I work with the GGNB certification scheme, a sustainability certification for buildings. And we have launched this GGNB Heart to focus on the indoor climate, but also some of the other well-being or comfort aspects of both offices and dwellings. And we have tried to raise the bar and say, well, we want to have some incentives to do better than just minimum requirements in the building code. And for example, in the building code we have ventilation requirements for the flat, so the combined. So we have some kind of so many liters per second must be ventilated, and that works when you have one room or connected room, but when you close the door to your bedroom, it doesn't work anymore. Then you have no ventilation in your bedroom. And that is just an example where we have said we must measure the ventilation, the amount of fresh air, at room level and not at the flat level, not at the combined rooms in the dwelling. And we can, of course, be more and more specific in the building codes and say, but we also risk only pointing at very specific technologies that can achieve a good environment. And maybe the architects and others have some more passive features that could have helped with the same, or some other kind of solution that could have helped with the same level of indoor environment. So the more specific we are in the requirements, the more solutions we also exclude. And that is a fine balance, and how do we measure the parameters of the very good indoor climate.
Going back to actually Johanne's point that we need to have that negotiation for each building. So as, and I see Sven nodding, and do just interrupt us if you have a comment, but I keep that brings me to the question then, who do we ensure contribute to the negotiation of each building? Because I think, Lau, you have a very good point in that there is a wide array of technological solutions. The more specific we become in the requirements for each building and the performance we want, we exclude the technologies. But it brings me to the point that I heard in another debate, namely that a lot of the buildings that were built in the late 19th century were built for private residence. But they are now highly coveted workspaces. So they were designed for one thing or built for one thing, and they're used to something completely different today. My point is not in any specific way, except just then how do we ensure who is negotiating the performance criteria of these buildings from its conceptualization, if you like, and then as it goes through various phases. I'm tapping into to one of you basically said this is the professional complexity that we're dealing with. I think it was you, Johanne. Yeah. Do you have a recommendation, Jørn, on that?
I think that's actually a challenge that is being discussed quite a bit. If we had a crystal ball and could see how the building would be used for the next 100 years, as they typically
wouldn't that be nice?
That would be nice. Yeah. So it's only a matter of the designers to try to be as foresee the flexibility that is required after the building has been brought into use.
Yeah, and it brings me to Jakob Strømand from Larsen, who isn't here, but was interviewed to a magazine that's being released this week in Børsen. Just so everyone, if now you're curious, where is he saying this? He has been interviewed and states, it would be so nice if the architects actually stayed in the process of creating a building after they've submitted the first, the sketch of the building. It's tapping into what you also said, Lau, that the architects, it's a visual art form, if you like, but when the building has to be constructed, then there are many other things that then have to be part of that building. So Jakob is saying the architects need to actually commit themselves throughout the process. Could that be one way, maybe not to have the crystal ball, but certainly to continue or extend the dialogue? Johanne?
Well, obviously I would say yes.
Yes.
Because that's what we do.
You're allowed also to say but.
And I think...
Is it easy? Is this easy?
Well, it's a matter of prioritizing. In your company, for us, it's the way that we do things.
Yeah.
It's a way of doing it, and going back to economy and who's paying and all of that. It's a way of doing things. It's a way of not accepting that the knowledge that is being created or could be created in the use phase, that we just miss out on that as designers, because it doesn't make sense. So that's the whole reason why an architectural firm like AART has hired an anthropologist like me, because otherwise why would they do that? That doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but it really does. Yeah. If you want to actually revisit and kind of harvest the knowledge on how your design was working, it makes sense. And which also kind of made me want to follow up, Lau, if that's okay with you, because Do you know how well rated these buildings that we, on an objective scale, kind of, you could give the stamp if they have like the greatest standard of indoor climate? How well are they actually rated by the residents? How well do they perceive the indoor climate as being? Do we know?
No, we don't know. And it is
That's
very
interesting
interesting
as
question.
well.
We are working on a system, a POE, post-occupancy evaluation system.
We're
that we
part
want
of that
to,
as well.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
and that is very good. We want to implement it on all buildings being certified. So everybody who builds have a building, certify the building, automatically also get a POE when there are people in the building, also in the phase where building are using the building. We certify it on the build level, and now there's a phase where people are using the building, and we need to measure it at that time. And we want to do it systematically and to get the feedback.
Yeah.
And we don't get that today.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is also that we often design building for one specific usage. We have this law firm, they want to have a building, they have 200 people employed, only need space for 200 people. 10 years later, some governmental institution takes over and moves in, and maybe there are 400-500 people, and then they complain about the poor indoor quality. Of course they do, because it's not
of
designed
course
for
they
it.
do.
And who has the responsibility to raise the flag and say, well, actually the building is only designed for 200 people.
Yeah.
How come you put 400 people? What is the use case of that? Have you calculated how much that cost in poor performance quality? Have you calculated in how many sick days you are going to get for that? Of course you haven't, but you should do that.
Yes, and here you're actually mentioning, I have a question for you, Sven, but just tapping into what you're mentioning in terms of that and I think you also said, we actually do know a lot about well-being. We do know that poor, and also you said it loud in terms of that, as research has documented, that poor indoor climate has a huge impact on performance. But not just on performance in terms of productivity, but also in terms of health. People do get sick if the indoor climate is not good. There is a reason why we're debating these things, because there is a correlation in terms of sick days in workplaces. And Sven, you also said if people actually don't air, or we don't have a proper ventilation system, we get mold, people don't realize it, and then they get sick. I mean, we are discussing healthy buildings for a reason, so I think that's a very good point. Sven, I'm going back to what, in terms of the post-occupancy evaluation, because you raised in the beginning, you actually mentioned that you do include your residents, your tenants, your users. Do you do that like concurrently or with interim phases? How did it work out when you had the collaboration with Tine?
Well, that was a special project because we have it when we plan retrofitting the building, we have this planning process where we interview the tenants and get data from the tenants and so on. We don't have it systematically when the building are run. We did that with Tine, and we got some very interesting results from that. So I think we, as an organization, we need to look into how we deal with that in the future, because right now we have a culture that, of course, that we are very much in dialogue, and fortunately we have tenants who complains if there is some complaints and some do not. That's of course the difference, but mostly we get signals from if something is wrong with the ventilation system or the heating system or something like that. We get information from single tenants, and from that on we can work into the problem. But maybe we should be more systematic in our ways of working with it. So that has been inspirational for having this questionnaire, very simple questionnaire that Tine has helped us with in this project.
Excellent. Jørn and Tine have actually asked to comment. So I'll let Jørn first, and
you
then
told us
Tine.
to disagree.
Absolutely. This is why we're here.
Yes,
We
yes.
have to debate, otherwise we won't move forward.
Yes, we've also used the post-occupancy evaluations for many years when we are surveying buildings, and that's absolutely fine in certification schemes and when you're going to evaluate the building, but it's not solving anything in itself. You have to use to diagnose if there's a problem in the building, so somehow feedback into the design process. So I think that's where we are now. We know how to query the occupants and get their impression of how things work, but now we just need to be able to use it in the future.
And how do we diagnose? Now I'm getting curious.
Yeah, that requires a little more work than just distributing a questionnaire. Absolutely, that requires probably repeated visits to a building if there's a problem with some issues in the building, and try to find out what it is. And then use that. See, okay, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. You said yourself, when people feel uncomfortable, they tape the ventilation supplies or put clothing in it and so forth, and that's also what we have seen. So people respond to something they find uncomfortable, absolutely, when they can feel it. It's not all the impacts of the indoor environment that we have sensors for. So many chemicals will enter our bodies without us knowing it.
Exactly.
But when something is uncomfortable, we will try to change that, that's for sure.
And it's tapping into what Lau also said, that the more technological it appears to, for example, someone like me, the less inclined I am to actually familiarize myself with that technology. So, I mean, when you're diagnosing, one thing is, I have heard from another researcher conducting, this was office space, where they placed the sensors incorrectly. So the ventilation system was fed with incorrect data. So that was easily diagnosed in the sense if you could move the sensors or place new sensors. But I think you're also tapping into the diagnosis aspects in terms of user evaluation, and this might be of inspiration to you, Sven, is actually to set what is it that we're diagnosing. Something we can diagnose by visits, by observations, by questionnaires, and other things we cannot diagnose easily just by meeting with the occupants or the users of the building. Would that be a fair?
Yeah, that just also my point was that it requires some technical knowledge.
Yeah,
absolutely, how the building works.
I'm gonna return to the technology because I find it utterly fascinating. But Tine, you also had a comment.
Yeah, it was also for the questionnaires, because we had actually 500 answers back. So it was a lot of data. And it was distributed in renovated buildings, but also not renovated buildings. And the very interesting part was actually that we could actually analyze based on that. Okay, the renovated buildings, they were way too warm in summer, so everything where we thought, oh, it was so nice, and they had these new dwellings was actually too warm. The ventilation was noisy, it was a draft, so it was also kind of analyzing and spotting, so you could use it for future design and change some of it. Yes, so it was just another way to use the questionnaires.
Because we know from going back to the sensors and the technology, we actually know that there is a lot of technology available to us. Lau, you've also already raised that there is such a wide array of technologies that sometimes we exclude technology the more concrete we become in our ambition for one specific building. But I have heard, there seems to be, from some of the discussions that I have heard over the last just few months in terms of smart buildings, there seems to be two different, and I'm rudely now presenting a schism that could be a scale, suffice it to say. There are some people that advocate that the technology should be integrated in the building design. There are other people, in contrast, saying that we should have dumb buildings and then add the technology, because the innovation at the moment is of such a pace that the technology is rapidly improved, and therefore the building should be created in such a way that we can replace the outdated technology. Is that a schism that you can relate to? Would you agree to the latter, that we should create the stupid buildings and then add the technology? Or should we embed, because that's also the strand in terms of sustainable, that we actually start integrating the technology in the materials we use for the building? It's two very different ways to go, as I see it.
I think there's a question of timescales. We don't build for short-term use. We build for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And I can't access my early emails. I have a lot of floppy disks lying somewhere that I have no way to read today, and that is only like in a very, very short time span.
Yeah.
And so if we rely too much on technology, we are also going to have buildings that have a very short lifespan, functioning lifespan.
Yeah.
So I'm very much of the school that we should make dumb buildings that works very well in like with the passive measures, and then we can apply technology, high-tech, smart city, in a more superfluous fashion to compensate for some of the stuff, for some of the problems.
Johanne, what would you as an anthropologist say to that?
Well, maybe just a slightly different take on it, because I think one of the problems is that there's also a gap in expectations. So when you present a user with a building calling it a smart building, you kind of get a lot of expectations as a user, whereas if you're presented to a building called as a dumb building, kind of going back to Jørn's point earlier on what would I accept as a user. I think acceptance and also tilfredshed.
Satisfaction.
Satisfaction, thank you, would be a lot higher. And what you say makes a lot of sense, but I don't have a technical perspective on it. But from a user perspective,
and we
that
may
makes
not
sense.
sell the building as a dumb building, but I
No,
think
yeah.
that, just to clarify that, that's not what I'm
well, maybe you
advocating.
should, because maybe that would actually make sense. Never mind, yeah.
Jørn, what was...
I think a dumb building can actually be a very intelligent building, because if we think of a dumb building as a building that has passive means for controlling the indoor environment instead of automatic systems, then it actually requires a lot in the design phase to have a properly working building in terms of where should we put the thermal mass, how can ventilation be achieved without a fan, and so forth. So a dumb building, in my view, would actually be a very intelligent building. I know that's contradictory, but...
No, it makes it's wonderful, and it leads me to ask the question: who do we include in the design phase then, to make sure that this is actually an intelligent building? Do you have any takes on that?
I think it's the same as those who design buildings today. They know this, so it's just a matter of ambition. Which direction do you want to go? Do you want to achieve the energy goals by having this very tight building, which is very tightly controlled, or would you rather have it more loose and then have these passive means to control?
So you wouldn't advocate that we start inviting the occupants or the users that we are...
No, because this is not a user perspective. This is a building as a physical object perspective, and we often start with the wrong place with a building like this, with a lot of glass, and then it goes downhill from there. So if you want to take it seriously, you have to start by defining the goal of the building very early, before you make the drawing, before you fall in love with some specific design as a visual design from the outside. And of course, there are lots of very good solutions, as a practical solutions, buildings being built today that have another perspective. But the ones we see that are on the magazine page are often not the buildings that perform very good in terms of indoor environment.
But
Tine?
it actually brings us back to where we started. Because I think it was Lau who said that indoor environmental quality is actually just made for compensating poor architecture. So actually, I kind of agree, because it should be the other way around, because it is the design that actually should promote good indoor environmental quality.
Exactly.
Yes.
So starting out with, okay, how do we want leading the way to maximum standards? We're actually getting to the point, what you're saying, a building should no longer be compensating.
Yes.
Like the indoor climate should be integrated in the goal of the building from the very inception of the design. Do you like that notion, Sven? I'm thinking you should
Oh,
be
I love
very
it.
happy right now.
Yes. I love
Yeah?
it.
Like,
Yes, because
this
in
bodes
our
well.
world, operation is also very important. How can we operate buildings over a long time period and still have a payable rent for the tenants? So I think the well-designed building with a minimum of technology who has to be replaced is for the good, I think, and it also should be. If you go back to ages, we didn't have this kind of technology, So we should be able in our society to build houses who are well designed, and then technology can help us getting steps further. But basically, we should be able to build houses with low technology with low cost of operation.
It's. I would agree. I was dumbfounded in one debate where we had panelists saying we built better in the 1950s than today, and I actually sent this to you as kind of, do you agree? Because it left me slightly speechless, to be honest. So you're tapping into that question there, Sven. But I know Johanne and Lau have comments, so I'll let Johanne go first.
Well, it was just building on both of you that defining an early goal is, I understand, as defining early goals for indoor climate quality, but obviously, and when I listen to you, Lau, I hear a premise in your argument about design and architecture being about aesthetics, where from my point of view, architecture is about impact. It's about not so much the form, but what can architecture do? What kind of impact can we create through architecture? So being intelligent from the beginning, making dumb buildings is for me a lot about actually setting and defining goals about indoor climate, but then a lot of other things, because a purpose of a building is never good indoor climate. That's not why we build a building. We build a building, we build a school because we want children to learn, because we want children to thrive, and we want a school to help lift an urban community or whatever.
It's actually, we want indoor climate because it's raining, it's cold, it's windy outside. It's very difficult to sit with your book outside and learning.
But
so
that's just one
climate.
thing. That's like, yeah.
No, I think it's an interesting, because now we're getting back to maybe we haven't tied the knot, Tine, just because you're identifying goals, and one of the things that Jørn also talked about earlier was the performance of a building. And I don't think we can necessarily equate those. When you talk about goals and you literally we put it in plural, a healthy buildings, we do know from the research, are an important factor in ensuring, i.e. healing, learning, well-being, performance. And going back to the intangibles, we don't necessarily know as we enter a building whether the acoustics are good or bad. We have all been attending family parties or work parties where we go to the dining hall and we realize, oh my God, this is not working, right? But we didn't know when we entered the building. The point being that we actually know in terms of space, which is fascinating, that we read the room with our body within nanoseconds. So from you enter, for example, the hospital or the school or the workplace or a private home, you know, does this work for me? And one psychologist said our automatic reaction are the typical fight, flight, or freeze. So we immediately navigate and orientate where can we escape. My point being that a healthy building does have a huge impact on performance. But, as you said earlier, Johanne, a building can have other functions, i.e. ensure a community spirit or ensure social inclusion or whatever. So, but still going back to, we need to define those goals. Be it a performance, the indoor climate. Lau was saying currently it's raining in Copenhagen, we're protected, we're inside. But also the goals in terms of should the building that we're designing, does it have a function that we can actually explicate? Can we define it? Does that make is that something that you, yeah? Tine, you're allowed to.
Yeah, but I actually agree with Johanne, because even though it hurts me a little bit, but I actually agree. Even though we said we wouldn't agree before we started, but there is much more than indoor environment. But actually, creating the buildings is to protect us from the outside. We need to go inside, so we need to create something where we actually feel good, we are comfortable, and also the healthy aspects. I think that the health aspect, because now we're talking a lot about healthy buildings, is actually also the dangerous part, because that's the one we cannot sense ourselves mostly. It's PCB, it's the mold, it's all the different risks that we will not sense ourselves. So as designers, we are actually, we need to design the building so that it is healthy, because we can feel the comfort. Is it too warm? Is it too cold? That's what we can feel, but the health aspect is also quite important. But I also agree there's more in the design than indoor environment. That's also a very important aspect in this health and comfort unity.
But it's also a very banal thing, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
But if it's very banal, then why haven't we made sure that it happens as a natural thing?
It's difficult.
Why is it difficult?
I would shoot at the architects, but they probably would shoot back.
Yes.
Well, maybe that's one of the points, is that we have a business model within the building society that doesn't promote collaboration and cooperation. And as you said, it doesn't promote actually following up, revisiting projects, because who should pay for that?
Yes.
Then we have the scientists, the researchers doing that, but getting that knowledge out into practice there's also a gap there. So, yeah.
Actually, I would say most of the buildings being built today are quite good. Both in terms
Wonderful.
of...
You're restoring my optimism.
Yeah. Both in terms of the indoor environment and all different other qualities. Both in a national context, but especially international context, we have really strict requirements for indoor climate in Denmark.
Yeah.
And we have it also for the very cheap buildings, as also for the social housing, also for all the buildings that when we get abroad, other countries we see as very, very poor quality. So I think we should remember that we are actually quite good here in the northern parts of Europe, and we also, because we have some really bad weather outside.
Yeah.
But it leads me to another point about climate change. We are getting warmer and warmer climate. It's not only because we are changing the architecture that we are getting a problem of overheating in the summer. It's also because we are getting a lot more sun in the summer and a lot warmer climate. So maybe we should look down to Germany and southern part in Europe on how to design the dome buildings, how to use passive measures. And they don't have huge windows. They have maybe windows, and they could maybe be large, but then at least they have some kind of shutters outside, so they can block out the sun. And we should look at the solutions like that for the future climate here in Denmark.
We have from Lasse Rode actually a comment saying, yes, buildings should not rely on smart technology to provide good indoor environments. The passive measures and good design should get us most of the way. And he continues, and thank you, Lasse, smart technology may assist us in reaching top quality performance for specific scenarios, such as very specific use or critical scenarios. So Lasse is basically agreeing with some of your points here. We're reaching the last part of our debate. So if you have any comments or questions, please write them now so I have a chance to receive them, because I actually wrote to these wonderful people yesterday and saying, from the perspective of ensuring the holistic approach or perspective in designing buildings and making sure that we build buildings that perform, or in any way that you may define it. You may have a wish, you can bring a wish to each other today. So my question now, of course, Sven, do you have a wish to these wonderful people on the panel today? Because you know Tine, if you could ask Tine for anything more than what you've already obtained from your wonderful collaboration, what would that be, for example?
I will have I think that's not maybe not very holistic, but about ventilation. Have a more. Can we get more natural ways of ventilation? Getting these mechanical solutions. I don't think myself they are the future, but I think alternative. We miss maybe some good alternatives for this mechanical solutions. So I hope so that's my wish for the future, to get new solutions for ventilation.
It's a good wish. It's duly noted. Lau, do you have a wish?
Oh, that's a difficult one.
Yes.
More architects like art that actually takes it seriously to get feedback from the buildings they create. That would be a really good scenario. Yeah.
Johanne?
I'm so surprised by the whole recognition here that I'm dumbstruck. Well, I think somehow connecting researchers and Green Building Council with practical life in architectural firm like ours, an engineering firm, I think is definitely the way forward, because there's so much knowledge that is there, but isn't necessarily being used, and it needs a translation in order to be used in everyday, very, very busy life. So somehow gaining access to all of these clever people, and then also having them help translate their research and their findings into formats that can actually be easily used in everyday life, in everyday projects, and that can help us define these really important impact goals, and also the possible solutions of passive solutions for dumb buildings, for example, which is something that I will definitely take back to the architects. So that's for all
Yeah,
of
and
you.
that should be easy, right?
Yes.
Yes.
No, not at all.
thing.
No, what sustains our activities, which very broadly formulated is research to the benefit of society, is something like this, input from the surrounding world, so that we can design our studies and hopefully contribute to making buildings better in the future. So that's very beneficial. It's not a request or wish, but it's more like an encouragement.
Yeah. And Tine, you have actually developed, or have tried to develop, a language to cover these various aspects, parameters of indoor climate.
Yes, so that was actually my wish, because
Yeah.
I would like to make this much more tangible, give this language to everybody and then use it. So hopefully it will be more easy to work with indoor environment also very early in the design, because I think that's where we really can change something, that we actually apply it at a very early stage.
Yeah. I asked Finua Pind, who was one of our speakers at the Science Talk and has done a lot of research in acoustics and has developed a simulation product so that you can actually include acoustics early on in the design process. His take on why is it we know so much about light now. We really know so much about light and its impact on our health. On our well-being, on our individual performance as such. And then we have so much knowledge about acoustics. And I asked him, why do they come across as respective silos that do not in any way converse? And he looked at me and said, it's as if we've spent a lot of years tapping into what you were saying, that we actually do. We know so much today, and we are also able to build really good buildings. But in average, it's as if now we need someone to translate that amazing expert knowledge that we have within the various parameters to make sure that we have buildings that are good to be in, to work in, to live in, to spend time in, and also good, as I opened up this debate earlier on, also in terms of using the right materials. We have, as you said, the sustainability aspects as well.
Yeah, it's just a short comment for that, because it's also a matter of demand.
Yeah.
Because you can see that focus is changing.
Yes.
If you look at dwellings today, a lot of people are actually putting up acoustic ceilings.
Yeah.
If you just saw that 10 years ago, nobody cared.
No, then it came afterwards, didn't it? As
They
an
had the
add-on.
feeling that it was very noisy. We had all this glass, very hard surfaces everywhere, and they couldn't actually talk to each other because there was two children playing, running around the table. You couldn't hear what the person was saying on the other side. So the demand is also changing, and I think time is also with us in that perspective, because we have a focus now on health. Organic food, organic clothes, or a lot of different certification systems for everything. So of course that aspect and focus on health will also benefit us, you could say, because there is actually a demand which is increasing for this.
I know from John McComber, Joe Allen's partner, that is actually what he's documenting now, is an increasing demand on exactly that. So I think you're absolutely right. Lasse, thank you for being so active. Lasse has written, I believe we can keep the large windows for connection between in and out, tapping into Johanne's point earlier on. Good daylight, good views, etc. But our current practice in architecture could do well to bring overhands back into fashion. So here is another wonderful wish. And then just to finish off, I'm getting the last one in. My wish, and thank you for that, we have Lasse continuing. Inhabitants are concerned with indoor environmental comfort. Engineers are concerned with both comfort and health. That's a very, very nice point. My wish for the future would be that architects, engineers, and building owners collaborate to also be concerned with well-being from an indoor environmental perspective. And I think, Lasse, with that, you literally just got the entire panel to nod in agreement. It is a very beautiful and humble wish, I might add. I think there is a lot of optimism in that for a beautiful future. We have reached the end of our debate today. I would like to thank this amazing panel of participants. Tine, Jørn, Johanne, Sven, you are formidable, and I think you have helped us make this grand finale of the holistic perspective on healthy buildings, and you have also shown us, albeit complex and difficult, it is definitely possible to make sure that we have healthy buildings now and in the future. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.